First of all, if you don't know who Vint is, you shouldn't be here. Secondly, Vint has been supportive of this perspective of asking what the future of text might be for longer than either one of us would be embarrassed to admit. When I was teaching a few years ago, Vint came to London and he talked to all the students. And there was a really wonderful moment. Yes, okay, I can use this. There was a really wonderful moment where some teachers said something, students said something back and forth, and I had to explain the origins of the internet. And I was trying to get across to the students that the internet was created by graduate students. And like in a Woody Allen movie, I asked Vince, you're here, why don't you take over? So if you don't mind giving us a brief overview then, with the emphasis that students, being a student is an amazing thing. You have a license to go out to talk to people. Once you're no longer students, you're an adult of sorts. When you're a student, people will want to encourage you. They will want to interact with you. So Vince, on that note, please give us a brief overview of how you changed the universe.
First of all, it would be entirely inappropriate to give credit to any one person for the thing that we call the internet today. First of all, two of us began the work, but it was built on the history of a predecessor network called the ARPANET, which is sponsored by the American Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And it was designed for academic purposes to link a collection of universities together in the late 1960s in order to accelerate research in, guess what, artificial intelligence. So AI is not new. AI and its aspirations have origins way back in the mid-1950s when the term was first coined by John McCarthy. However, the thing that we tackled in the ARPANET project was building a network using a new technology called packet switching, which you can think of as electronic postcards, to link disparate computers together from different vendors. So we had IBM and Digital Equipment Corporation and Hewlett-Packard and a whole bunch of others. They all had different operating systems and different character encodings and everything else. So we designed and built a set of computer communication protocols that would allow these machines to talk to each other over the internet so the researchers could share each other's software and each other's computing capability so that ARPA could accelerate this research into AI. And at the time, you should appreciate that AI was a kind of hit or miss thing. I guess even today you could say the same thing, but back then it was called heuristic programming. And roughly speaking, I would say that meant that if it didn't work all the time, it was heuristics. If it worked all the time, that was engineering. And so AI at the time was very heuristic, and it didn't scale terribly well. But it evolved, and eventually a new idea came along called expert systems, where you codified the knowledge that someone had by asking them questions and then trying to characterize what they knew and what they could infer in what we would call if-then-else clauses. So if this symptom is manifest, then there is a probability of 28% that the patient has a certain disease and therefore you should go and run this test. Or perhaps provide this medication or some other therapy. So the expert systems worked interestingly well, but they also didn't scale very well. And after you got tens to hundreds or even thousands or more of these if-then-else clauses, they started to conflict with each other. And you couldn't quite sort all that out. So that didn't work out too well either. In the background, kind of like the mammals that are running around beneath the feet of the dinosaurs, there were people who were studying neural networks. And some of these emerged in the early 1960s. The one that the granddaddy of them all was a one-layer neural network. And it turns out that you have a single layer, which is taking input in, it's doing something to the input, and then something comes out the bottom. It doesn't really work very well. And Marvin Minsky and Seymour Papert at MIT noticed that this was a kind of a weak construct, and they wrote a book called Perceptrons, which disparaged the notion of neural networks. Sadly, they didn't take the next obvious step, which was to ask the question, would the weaknesses of a single layer network be mitigated by adding more than one layer? And if they had gone down that path, they would have discovered, as we have subsequently, that a multi-layer neural network is in fact capable of doing some pretty amazing things. So in today's world, you see the chatbots of the world doing things that are quite surprising, but often surprising in a negative way, that is to say hallucination and other sorts of counterfactual output. Now, what I'm pretty sure Froden was hoping for is a little bit more on the internet side. Let me just sort of summarize that after having got the ARPANET to work, the Defense Department said maybe we could use computers in command and control. But if we were serious about that, to sort of use those computational assets to manage our resources better, we would need for the computers to be mounted in mobile vehicles, in ships at sea, and in aircraft. And the ARPANET project had only put computers in air-conditioned rooms with dedicated telephone circuits connecting everything together. It's a very fixed environment. So the Internet project incorporated mobility and long distances through satellite hops, variable delays, and the like. The networks were all different in terms of addressing structure, packet sizes, delay, data rates, and so on. And yet, when Bob Cohn and I started working on this in 1973, our objective was to take these disparate concepts of packet switch networks and make them look uniform from the standpoint of a computer connected to any one of those networks. We wanted any computer on any network to be able to reliably talk to any other computer on any other network. So that was our objective, and we pursued that, and we went through multiple iterations of the design of the protocols that allowed this to happen. And by 1983, we were able to turn it on operationally. A few years later, a commercial service emerged, especially after multiple government investments in large-scale networks. The Department of Energy built the Energy Sciences Network. NASA built the NASA Science Internet. NSF built the NSF-NET backbone. And of course, ARPA had the original ARPANET plus the packet radio and satellite nets. They were all interconnected to each other. And by the early 1990s, Tim Berners-Lee at CERN saw an opportunity to take his idea for the World Wide Web and layer this on top of the internet, which by that time had gotten fairly widespread, although we're still speaking 30 years ago. Well, he succeeded in releasing the World Wide Web. Not too many people noticed, except for a couple of guys at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications out in the middle of a cornfield in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina, who said, you know, that was an interesting text-based interface that Tim Berners-Lee exhibited for his World Wide Web, but they had an idea for a graphical user interface, which could incorporate not only formatted text, but imagery and ultimately, of course, video and streaming sound and the like. And so they built a graphical browser called Mosaic. And around 93, it was propagated throughout the network. It was given away freely because the National Center for Supercomputer Applications was sponsored by the National Science Foundation. Well, one of the observers of this phenomenon of the Mosaic browser was the founder of Silicon Graphics. And he took one look at this thing and said, this is a big deal. And he brought Mark Andreessen, Eric Bina, and some others to the West Coast to start a company called Netscape Communications. They released their Netscape Navigator graphical browser, and they went public in 1994, and the stock went, they went public in 1994, the stock went through the roof. And the dot boom was on. Silicon Valley was throwing money at anything that looked like it might have something to do with the internet. Well, the dot bust hit when all of the business models that didn't have any revenue failed, and then the landscape is littered with the dead bodies of companies that didn't have a business model that worked. But a few of the companies that were started during that period survived and thrived, two examples of which are Amazon in 1994 and Google in 1998, and in between Yahoo, which reached its peak and then has kind of petered out since then. So I hope that's a fair summary of the important points of history. The one thing I would also add to all this is the arrival of the mobile telephone, specifically the smartphone. Mobile telephony gets started in 1973, goes operational in 1983, literally in parallel with the internet. But the smartphone shows up in 2007, and that's Steve Jobs and Apple contribution. It is internet enabled as well, and suddenly you've had mobile access to all of the assets of the internet. The smartphone makes the internet more accessible, and the internet makes the smartphone more useful. And now there are millions of applications. Now that preamble, Frode, from my point of view anyway, sets us up for the conversations that you've been having and I hope we'll have. And that has to do with what does text have to do with all of this and why do we care about it? And probably the most important aspect of text that I would assert is that that is how we have managed to preserve knowledge and history and to share it, especially the past sharing with the future and the future discovering what we have known in the past. And our ability to preserve text in various forms has maintained this vast and growing knowledge base that we rely on every day. The media that have been used in the past to preserve text have been remarkably robust. I was at dinner last night with a colleague and old friend who runs a restaurant, but next to the restaurant is a personal library of his that contains things such as Newton's private library with his annotations in the margins. Massive texts from the 1500s and even the 1400s of medical texts, showing how the body is constructed, how the bones hook together. Incredibly well illustrated and physically well preserved. He showed us an Albert Dürer print, which was auctioned off at, I guess, Christie's, that was labeled superb. In all of history and my acquaintance with these things, I have never ever seen such a thing labeled superb by Christie's. Sometimes good, very good, excellent, never superb. It was so good that you could see the tiniest of lines in this fine-grained, beautiful print. So our job, I think, part of our job anyway, is to make sure that the principal means by which our knowledge has been kept and has been preserved can be preserved in our new digital world, because a vast amount of all the text is generated now, plus all the other imagery and visible things, is done in digital form, and it's stored in electronic means. Most of those electronic media do not have longevity. Then the problem is twofold. The first one is that things like CD-ROMs, even if they still have bits on them, aren't easily read because you can't find a reader for them because nobody makes the readers anymore. Or the same thing could be said for a 5 1/4 inch floppy disk or an 8-inch long word processor disk or a 3.5 inch floppy disk. Or DVDs. It used to be that DVD players were readily available, but now you use streaming video instead. So all of those conveniences and all of the online digital storage makes it feel as if everything is there all the time. Mm-hmm. But any one of you who's used the web will have encountered 404 page not found. And that is a consequence not of the physical technology, but it's a consequence of the business models that support this kind of online operation. And if we don't have sustainable business models for the preservation of digital content, we are going to lose it. So it's a very serious problem. And so that's my rant about digital dark age threats and things like that. The other side of this discussion, and the thing which Frode has focused on so effectively, is how do we make use of text that is available to us in a different form than the previous media. Previous media have tended to be static. And the medium that we can work with today, that we're literally using at this moment, is anything but static. It's fungible, it is manipulable, it can be transformed, the content can be viewed in a variety of different ways, manipulated in various ways, and any people who have seen some of Froda's software, the reader and author text and the like, will have seen the rapid way in which he and others are able to manipulate a text to help understand its structure, content, relationships, and the like. If you haven't seen it, please go on the web and look for the mother of all demos, Doug Engelbart, 1968, who had a demonstration way back then, very much like what you will see from Froda, where text is leaping around on the screen, lines are being interconnecting things. He is exploring a textual space through a variety of different lenses and manipulating tools, which is what Engelbart was also trying to do, except that what Freud has done, I think, is substantially more elaborate because he has more computing power available plus display capabilities. Now, I'm not going to go down the 3D path particularly. I know Freud is quite excited about the fact that you can create visual spaces in 3 dimensions by putting on a headset. I'm still a little skeptical about how comfortable and effective that kind of environment is going to be. But ARPA was exploring ideas along these lines at one point. It had what was called the Spatial Database Management System. And the prototypical example was somebody sitting in an easy chair with a big screen in front of them with some manipulators. And you would fly through this 3-dimensional space, and if there were filing cabinets, they would whisper and more loudly as you got closer to them about what they had in them. And then you could dive into the filing cabinet and it would open up, and it's sort of like one of those visual examples of how does this motor work? And it explodes all the parts so that you see them all separately, and then you can see how they all fit together. So there may very well be some very exciting possibilities in this 3D space. I'm not yet as comfortable as I think Froda has become with that medium. But I hope that in the course of the discussions that you're having, that you will have explored some of the possibilities and potential that computing power is offering to us. And you notice I haven't said a thing about large language models, but they too are manipulating text, and they are producing and generating text. They are new tools, very complex ones, not necessarily very predictable, to allow us to generate or explore the text that has been ingested into the system. One thing I will say about these large language models is that they have superior recall compared to most human beings. They remember everything. However, they also have the ability to generate counterfactual output because they often lack a certain amount of context about where this text came from and what its meaning was. So Froda, I hope I haven't bored everybody, but that's sort of how I'm thinking these days about the text world and how it's evolving right before our eyes.
I have a very brief question for you. Dean has some more structured questions, and then we have a very engaged audience here. The first question is, could you talk a little bit about how the internet is not a net, it is a network of networks? Because to really drill that home, I think will be very important for the XR environments we're building, that they're not going to be walled up little cities. We need to work to make them connected.
Well, the internet was certainly, the original ARPANET was one network. Internet is multiple networks, tens of thousands of them. They're all interconnected in a variety of ways. But even the simple classical model of a collection of networks interconnected and a bunch of computers on the outside is no longer adequate to explain the thing that we're working with now. First of all, it has middle boxes that are not just routers. That are able to see and sometimes manipulate content. Moreover, it's multiply layered. Things are encapsulated in other things. Virtual private networks are a form of encapsulation, for example. So it's a much more complex object than the simple model that we had 50 years ago. And there's a couple of books by, oh dear, do I have it with me? Well, it's two of the researchers at Princeton University have written a book called The Real Internet. And I'm sure if you Google the real internet in Princeton, you'll be able to pull it up. They go into some detail about how the internet today runs. It's quite a bit more complex than the simple models that we had and built 50 years ago. But Froda's point is that it is a highly complex environment, and it is capable of substantial evolution. And it has supported a variety of applications, some of which were impossible until today, because today we have higher capacity both on the computing side and the communication side. The optical fiber networks, for example, that are part of the internet are often running at 400 to 800 gigabits per second per channel in the optical fiber, and one fiber can carry more than one channel. So the capacity is simply mind-boggling. And of course, the billions of people that use it are generating or accessing content 24 hours a day in vast quantities. So Froda's right, this is not a simple environment. In fact, it's become quite complex.
Are there questions from folks in the audience?
I've seen some questions in the chat, by the way. Should I respond to those?
Sure.
Can you suggest he answers the chat first?
Yeah, please answer one of the chat questions first.
So the first one was a citation for the filing cabinets. If you please look up Spatial Database Management System, SDMS, MIT, you should be able to pull up some references on the net to that work. It's back in the 80s, 70s and 80s, roughly speaking. And someone had put in, oh yeah, the Real Internet Architecture reference is in the chat as well. Thank you for that. And that's well worth your time to look at, to understand that the object that we are dealing with, the space in which you are working, is extraordinarily complex, but also extremely rich. So now let's see if we have some other live questions.
I'm also alarmed by the...
Brandel, can you just mention your name for the...
Oh, sure. My name is Brandel Zetchuk. I share your concern with sort of the limitations of our ability to archive the sort of the present state of things. But I'm also conscious that of the many pieces of information, the ephemera that were produced over the last 500 or so years, a lot of that doesn't survive. But at times there were sort of distinctions between what was destined to be ephemera and ephemeral consequence versus things that people understood to be, that something was drawn by Dürer. There's a good chance that people will want to kind of keep it around. Do you feel like we are in a position to know the difference between what we want to keep, or is that becoming more similar?
No, we are not. And just to give you an anecdote that explains this, I was meeting with a collection of librarians on this topic of digital preservation. And one young fellow got up and said, "Oh, this isn't a problem. The important stuff people will keep, and the stuff that and preserve, and the stuff that isn't important, they won't, and it won't matter." And of course, it took me half an hour to get the librarians off the ceiling, because they had to point out that some communications, some documents may not, the importance of those documents may not be understood for 100 years. Sometimes it's only looking back that you realize that particular point in history, that particular document, that particular meeting was the crux around which important events took place. So I would say we are far from understanding necessarily how to identify that which is important and that which is not. I'm not trying to say that we can't recognize something as important. We surely can. And we can make deliberate decisions to preserve things. But that brings me to a point that I would like to make. And if I were writing an essay right now, I would probably be thinking of titling it "The Desirable Properties of a Digital Preservation Regime." And I would ask what properties would enhance my ability to preserve? And so to your question, suppose we did know that something is important, and we did know that we wanted to preserve it, then the question would be, what avenues do I have for trying to assure that? You know, what capabilities are available to me? Now, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to walk down one little alley here for just 1 second. Think about some content that requires a piece of software for you to consume or manipulate. A spreadsheet would be an example. So imagine that the formatted content that is the content of the spreadsheet has a certain structure to it and can be stored digitally. But in order for it to make any sense, there has to be a piece of software that understands what that structure is and can let you manipulate. Well, in order to run the software, you have to have something, a computer, and probably an operating system, and a piece of application code to manipulate that piece of spreadsheet. So even if you preserve the bits of the spreadsheet, you need to preserve the ability to manipulate it, which means you might have to preserve the description of the hardware that runs the operating system, that runs the application that lets you manipulate the spreadsheet. So if we were looking for a regime to instantiate for preservation, we might ask the hardware makers, please document and preserve the description of the hardware and its instruction set. It's called ISA, instruction set architecture. Please preserve that. Make it available openly if you're no longer supporting that particular piece of hardware so someone could emulate it if necessary. Dear operating system makers, please hang on to the older operating systems. Don't lose them. Make them, even consider making them available to the general public if you're no longer supporting them. And similarly for application software, because you want the ability to resurrect content and its manipulability in the future. So we might have to pass laws, we might have to have special arrangements for archiving, maybe protections for who has access and under what conditions to some of that kind of information. But we need a preservation-friendly regime. And oh, by the way, on top of all that, we better have some kind of business models that allow the preservation to be sustainable. Because if it's not sustainable, then all of that work to preserve and archive and everything else will have been worthless if it's no longer supportable. So this is a big challenge in addition to your own consideration for what do we do with text in the future.
Yeah, thank you for that, Vint. So Deanie's lab here, right up the road, is absolutely tremendous in archiving and taking care of and making accessible work. And Deanie has to do exactly what you said. She has to have the physical computers. She has 80 Macintoshes. You have no idea how jealous I am. It is an incredible effort. And now with Andrew, they're putting it into flat 3D and virtual reality, so people can experience not just the digital aspect of the work, but also more of the experiential, aspect of what it was like to, so to speak, put the floppy in and do all these things. It's so important that there are so many different kinds of archival and access making things that we need to do in so many different fields.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit and talk about accessibility. And I know that you've been involved and interested in accessibility, especially for disabilities and sensory sensitivities. And given your interest in this, can you talk a little bit more about the importance of accessible text? I mean, you preserve it, but there's also the issue of making it accessible beyond the preservation mode. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you for that. And I'm going to use this term accessible in more than one way. First of all, whatever it is you're looking for needs to be discoverable, which means we have to pay attention to indexing and archiving and catalogs and all these other things to help us find stuff. Certainly the guys at Google recognized that, and they indexed everything. Full text indexing, we find things remarkably well in the web environment, and hopefully we will be able to replicate that capability as we try to extract content from large language models. So that's one kind of accessibility. It turns out I'm hearing impaired. I wear 2 hearing aids. My wife has 2 cochlear implants. Of course, I have friends who are blind or have low vision. So accessibility in that sense is also very important. How do we make things accessible to people with various limitations? And so what can be done, for example, screen readers, which are at best kind of a hack, and I'm not trying to insult anyone who's worked their lives, to build screen readers, JAWS, and the others. It's just that the web designers, the web page designers, do not always have intuition about how to design the page to make it easily rendered using the screen reader, for example. Or for someone who has color blindness, the people who are making charts and graphs who choose to use color as a way of differentiating kinds of information may not realize that that's not going to work for that cohort, and you need texture, for example, or shape as another distinguishing feature that doesn't rely solely on color. So my big worry about accessibility in that sense is that the people who are creating information or building user interfaces and APIs don't always have the depth of intuition and specific knowledge they need to compose this content in a way that makes it accessible to everybody. So, and of course we can't strive for perfection necessarily, but we could certainly try to draw attention to the fact that is an issue, and that there are cohorts of people who are not getting the same kind of access that the rest of the population is to content which they should have access to. So that's yet another concern I have for accessibility.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm seeing.
Sorry, yeah, please.
I was just looking at the chat again, and I thought, let me know when you want me to switch back over to trying to respond to chat.
It's just on the same topic on accessibility. In the lunch break here, there was some discussion with Christine about the vast limitations of the human brain. If we have a little bit more humility to understand the limitations, not just in accessible situations, but in all situations, maybe that perspective will get us a bit further along to actually figuring out what we should be doing and not just marching ahead. So that was really lovely to hear. Please address the chat, and I will give this over to Fabienne.
Okay, so the chat is well and healthy. So let's see. One comment about building geoballs and caves, for example, was a wonderful environment in which to explore information. And shared caves is where multiple parties are in a common virtual environment and can collaborate to explore information rendered in those environments. It's all very exciting. They did find the spatial database management system from the Media Lab. That's good. There's reference from Patrick Lichty to Stringer's Navahedron, which I do not know about, so that's new to me. And the comment about
is that one of the things that I really love is, like, in the 1990s, all these hyperbolic browser systems that were kind of based off of Xanadu. There was like Stringer's Stringer's Navahedron, and was it Noodlebox by Danny Brown, and then was it Stephen Holtzman Perspective View, and all these things. And one thing that I wrote for Froda is saying that these things can now be, say, for example, pulled out of the textual plane and then mapped onto the sides, and then turned into these geometric sort of things. But anyway, I didn't mean to cut in really quick, but this is something I'm just very passionate about. And I also have retinitis pigmentosa, and actually it's starting to get a bit advanced. I'm very interested in these accessibility issues in virtual spaces, especially like spatialization of sound, dealing with some of these things.
So thank you. That's a very helpful intervention, and I hope that your situation is at least has some remediable aspects to it. About preservation, just generally speaking, I think that even if we don't know for sure what should be preserved and what we can ignore, if we do think something should be preserved, there should be tools for doing that. I mean, we should have a regime that permits us to preserve that which we think should be preserved, even though we all know there will be surprises. In the library where I was last night, we had a look at something that was called the Archimedes palimpsest. And some of you may have heard about this. It was a manuscript that was written in 1000 AD. It was copying works of Archimedes from 300 BC. And the monk who did the copying included some illustrations and things like that, including the stomachion, which is a 37-piece puzzle that can be assembled into a square in tens of thousands of different ways. So this document with the Archimedean work was kept in the monastery for a couple of hundred years. And in 1200 AD, the abbot decided that the vellum was more important than the content, and proceeded to erase as much as possible of the Archimedean Greek. Cut the vellum in half and rotated it 90 degrees, and proceeded to have the owner's manual of the monastery written there, like which songs were to be sung and what time of the day and what kinds of food we eat and so on and so forth. So this thing is in the monastery now for another 700 years. And around 1908 or so, a German philologist discovered this manuscript, and holding it in the light with his microscope or his magnifying glass, discovered that this nearly unreadable Greek was actually an Archimedean piece. And then it disappears and resurfaces in 1998 in the attic of some Frenchman's house in absolutely horrible condition. So for 10 years, the Walters Library in Baltimore was trying to extract from the palimpsest the actual Archimedean material. Some things had been lost for hundreds, if not thousands of years, or at least a couple of thousand years, and were retrieved by dint of effort. So the point I want to make here is that sometimes preservation happens by accident. Preservation by accident is not a plan.
No.
And I would like to see us have something a little bit more organized than that.
Just one more thing. There's a book that I really liked by a woman named Janaki. It's called Archive Everything. And so I have a museum and library, virtual museum and library that I've built called The Next. And my lab has rebuilt it and we continue to maintain it. It's got 3,000 works. Has the archives, the depository for them all, and so people send me the material, and folks ask me if I curate this space, and my answer is no. I take just about anything. If someone has created a piece of art that's digital, that has a narrative to it or poetics to it, I take it, right? And so the thing we're trying to do with the Next is kind of show the human expression from the time of computing, mainstream computing to the present. So it's not just a MoMA, for example. It's every day. So I'm following what Yanachi asked for, and that's archiving everything. Of course, the difficulty is having enough space, enough people, enough server space to maintain this. But it's a way to capture who we are right now in this late age of print, early digital age. So thank you for those comments. They really resonate well, I think, with the folks that I work with.